As Alex said, I am Faith Cullens Nobis, joined by Katie King here from Michigan. So we are very happy to be with you. So to get started today, we are going to tell you the story of a couple of farms. So the first farm is set in Maine, and where Katie and I recently visited in August. And it's a really beautiful farm, beautiful land, beautiful animals. And as I was there, I thought, how lucky to live on this land and and farm and see this every day. And the farmer told me that her luck ran out. You see, she was, along with her late husband, was taking biosolids, and they didn't know that the biosolids that they were spreading were contaminated with PFAS, also known as a forever chemical. So they did this because it's typically low cost or free, and it's fertilizer. It boosts your organic matter in the soil, and we thought it was safe. We didn't know. And she said, I often wonder what my late husband, who was a chemist, would think about it now that their land is contaminated, their water is contaminated, their cattle were contaminated. It was devastating. So she made the decision to work with the university and with the state government to try to find solutions for other farmers. Because we can't just write off the farms. We have to find solutions so that they can continue farming. A lot of amazing work has been done at this farm that we're going to highlight as we go through. And I've got a little blue arrow, meaning that's the main farm that we're going to be following. And then another story that we're going to follow is a Michigan farm. So this Michigan beef farmer was also taking biosolids that were contaminated, and he didn't know it. This farm had been in their family for over 100 years, and they'd been taking biosolids for about a decade. And in 2021, they were contacted by state regulators as they were looking at different wastewater treatment plants and the biosolids coming out of it. And they had reason to believe that his land may be contaminated. The wastewater treatment plant had been taking impacted effluent from a chrome plating facility that was using PFAS to suppress the hexavalent chromium that was in the air that's really toxic as well. It helps improve the stability of the chrome plating, improve the process. So the farmer discovered that his soil was contaminated and his cattle were contaminated as well. And his farm had a very different outcome than the main case study. And this isn't just in Michigan and in Maine. Here's some headlines from across the country. This is the Michigan farm that we talked about. Texas, it's in Texas as well. New Mexico, a large dairy farm impacted in New Mexico. Um, Oklahoma, it's everywhere. So what are PFAS? What are we talking about? And how did they get onto agricultural land? I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Katie now.
Awesome. So what and where are PFAS? PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a large class of over 12,000 different compounds. They're incredibly heat stable compounds, and they're known for their properties of being resistant to oil and water. So they're used in all sorts of consumer products. Like in the bottom right corner, they're in pizza boxing, popcorn packaging, food packaging, it's in floss, makeup, ski wax. And then a huge way it gets into the environment is through the use of firefighting foam or AFFF foam. These chemicals can be transported through the air, through groundwater, and through surface water, and then they can be taken up and bioaccumulate in plants and crops, animals, fish, and livestock, and also humans. And there are measurable levels in the blood of nearly all humans across the world. And these chemicals are remarkably resistant to destruction, which is why they get the nickname of being forever chemicals. The carbon fluorine bonds, which you can see in this middle picture, are very, very strong, one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry. So it makes them very hard to degrade in the environment, which is why they're so persistent and bioaccumulative. And then I do want to point out with this picture, the pink rectangle around two of these compounds, so two of the 12,000. These are two of the most highly studied PFAS that we know of. So we know the most about their toxicity, but they're called PFOA and PFOS. And then these were also two of the PFAS that were commonly used throughout the 1900s. And since the early 2000s, they've been voluntarily phased out of production in the United States. However, we're still commonly finding them in our soil, water samples, they're in our human blood, and in animals across the country. So some of the health effects that are associated with PFAS, these dark black lines are a higher certainty that they're associated with PFAS exposure. And then the dashed lines are a lower certainty, but still seeing an association with PFAS exposure. And one thing I want to note when you look at this is these are obviously all really, really scary impacts, but these are coming from high levels of exposure to PFAS over a long period of time. So like a high exposure over the course of someone's life are what's leading to these, not just because you eat one contaminated piece of food or like drink contaminated water one time. This is a chronic substance, so it takes that long-term exposure to see these effects. But as you can see, the health effects are like thyroid disease, liver damage, kidney cancer, and then some reproductive and developmental effects like reduced response to vaccines, and lower birth weight in offspring. And then another thing I wanted to point out is that the half-life to clear these chemicals is very variable depending on which compound you're looking at. For example, for PFAS, it's estimated that the half-life is between 3 years to 3 decades, so very variable depending on the person and depending on the compound. But it can take a long time to clear these substances once you ingest them. Some of the main routes of human exposure, the main three are water, food, and occupation. But then it's also thought that air, if you're in like a near a contaminated PFAS site, or potentially if you're like a farmer and you're inhaling dust or something like, or soil, air can be a way that you're exposed. And then a minimal way that you're exposed would be through dermal absorption. But more research is needed to understand kind of the impact that has. But one thing I want to stress is that testing your water is super, super important. Water you're drinking from the same source, usually multiple times a day. So if that's contaminated, that can be a main avenue of how people build up high levels throughout the course of their life. Along with food, food is a little bit harder because you're getting it from so many different sources and eating a variable diet, but food is also a way you can be exposed. And then occupations. Some of the main ones would be like chemical manufacturing. One that I thought was interesting is like ski wax technicians. They're using waxes that sometimes have PFAS, heating them up over the skis and then inhaling the volatile PFAS that way. Firefighters can be highly exposed, construction workers, people working with textiles and carpeting. And then, yeah, we need more information about how much of an exposure farming actually is. Because if your land is contaminated, then maybe you're inhaling it through soil or dust, or also your groundwater, which could be your water source, could also get contaminated as well. So this map here is showing the United States and the probability of PFAS being in the groundwater at the depth of public drinking water supplies. So these red areas, a lot of the times are in urban areas or sites where there may be like an airport or a military base or a different industrial PFAS site. But just estimating the probability of where contamination may be an issue. And from this, it's estimated that between 71 and 95 million people in the lower 48 states may be drinking contaminated groundwater. And for reference, I will talk about guidelines for PFAS in drinking water at the federal level. But for the PFOS and PFOA compounds, the maximum contaminant levels are only 4 parts per trillion to be considered contaminated by PFAS. And this figure here with the swimming pool shows just how small that really is. So 1 part per trillion, let's say the drop is PFAS, would be one drop in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So our drinking water standards federally are 4 parts per trillion for those compounds. So just 4 drops over a long period of time can have those health impacts. So for national efforts, as of April 2024, the EPA did finalize their first ever legally enforceable drinking water standards for 6 different PFAS compounds. And these were supposed to be within compliance by 2029. Now there is some discussion over what they're going to regulate, and so expect changes by moving that compliance date more towards 2031. And then also there's been talk about rescinding 4 of the PFAS maximum contaminant levels and keeping the PFOS and PFOA, which are those 2 that I pointed out earlier that we know more about the toxicity. So those will stay, but the other 4 that were initially going to have standards may be rescinded. And then one really important thing was that PFOS and PFOA are now considered hazardous substances under CERCLA, and the EPA did announce that they will be keeping this rule in place. And so this can be a challenge for farmers with liability because if PFOS or PFOA are running off of their property because of like spreading or just contamination on the farm at all, they may be considered passive receivers. And so that discharge off of their property may hold them liable, even though the farmer didn't necessarily like know they were contaminating or like maybe had purchased contaminated land. So hopefully more discussion happens about that so we that can protect farmers. Now I wanted to go into some state-specific drinking water regulations. I know we had some attendees from Iowa, some from Illinois, and then obviously Faith and I are from Michigan. So those are the three states I'm going to point out. But for Iowa, I reached out to the DNR and they shared with me that they had done some sampling in 21 and 2022. It was a three-tiered approach where they prioritized testing based off of the likelihood of contamination. And it was representative of at least 46% percent of the population. And then I linked the map to the test results over here. But as you can see, they're comparing these colors to the MCLs, which are equal to the federal MCLs that have been established for these compounds over here. And then PFBS at the bottom is just a health advisory level. But if they're red, that means they're above the MCL. Orange means that compounds were detected, but below the MCL. And then green means that there was a non-detect. So from this testing, 20 public water supplies with operating permits have been revised due to the sampling. And if they were detected above the health advisories, then they would require quarterly monitoring. And if they were above a certain threshold, then the state of Iowa would do an environmental site assessment to make sure that it wasn't a concern towards groundwater or soil in the surrounding area from where the water's coming from. And if you have more questions about that, there's a link below to the DNR website, or I would just recommend reaching out to the DNR specifically.
And Katie, can you explain MCL?
Yes, MCL is a maximum contaminant level, so the maximum amount of PFAS that's like allowed to be in the water and at considered a safe level. And so those values down in this legend over here are the MCLs that the federal government or the federal EPA had set. But then, like I said, they rescinded the values other than PFOS and PFOA. So for Illinois specifically, they also completed some testing. They had over 1,400 samples collected, and from these, 68 were above the health-based guidance levels, and over like 1,200 of them were non-detect. And I also linked the map of PFAS testing for that if you're interested in looking if there's PFAS contamination in your area. And then their website also had said that they were establishing maximum contaminant levels that are equal to the US EPA MCLs. And when I reached out for further clarification on if they would also be rescinding the other PFAS other than PFOA and PFOS, they said it was still a gray area and up for discussion. So they're kind of trying to decide what to do, if they'll just be regulating PFOS and PFOA, or if they'll extend to like PFNA, PFHXS, and Gen X.
And Katie, you said these are community water supplies. So what does that mean for people that are on home wells?
Yeah, so home wells, really anywhere in the country, you really want to make sure that you're monitoring what's in your water because it's not being regulated at a public water supply or a public treatment facility. So yeah, just I would recommend testing your water and comparing it maybe to these MCL values. And if it's above this, then maybe putting some type of filtration because there are options for filtration. You can do granular activated carbon or reverse osmosis filters, either at the sink or whole house filters to take care of that. So for Michigan, we have MCLs for 7 different PFAS compounds as of 2020. And I think if you click once, the animation will pop up with what those levels are. Yes, so this is Michigan's set of levels in our drinking water. And then we have a group called Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, and they've put together a really nice GIS map that has different samples from fish, from surface water, from public drinking water supplies. And then these purple dots are all PFAS sites. And then the pink are just areas of interest where the state needs to do some further investigation. And I just want to point out with this map that all of these samples don't necessarily mean that there's high levels of PFAS in that area. It just means that's where a sample was collected. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all of these sites are contaminated, although the purple ones actually are. So. So with that, let's move on to food. And trying to quantify what a safe level in food is can be really, really difficult because of a multitude of different things. Like, what is the total dose of PFAS you're consuming on a daily level, long term? How much PFAS are you getting through your water, through your total food intake, through your exposure to dust or any other exposures you may have? How much of the food are you actually consuming? Is it a child or an adult eating the food? Are there underlying health complications that need to be taken into consideration? And then you also have to think about which specific PFAS chemicals are being consumed. So right now we have no federal food safety standards and it varies state by state. But when you are measuring PFAS in food, it's typically on the parts per billion basis. So for water, like I was saying, parts per trillion is that one drop in 20 Olympic swimming pools. In food, it would be parts per billion, which is one drop in a 10,000 gallon pool. So, what is a safe dose? This is a very tough question to answer, and it's kind of all over the board on where people are falling. But this paper looks into a couple of different authorities or organizations and what they would consider a safe dose of PFOA to be. So, this is in parts per billion per day. The EPA 2023 draft is zero point zero 0.03, from 2022 is 0.0015, all the way up to Australia, where the level is 160 parts per billion, so much, much higher. And these are just for PFOA, which is one PFAS compound, compared to like the over 12,000 that actually exists out there. So yeah, this is really important to determine food safety with PFAS, but it's also quite a challenge because there's not a general consensus on the toxicity of each of these chemicals. So speaking of food safety standards, the European Union actually does have regulations on meat, like from cows, pig, poultry, game animals, fish, and then they also have guidelines for eggs. And what I want you to know on this figure here is specifically the PFOS column. If you look, it's the meat from cows, pigs, poultry. That would be 0.3 parts per billion is what they're saying their food safety standard is. And then compared to the United States, where we have no federal regulations, but the state of Maine does have action levels to where if products are testing above these levels, they have to stop sales until they can get them back below these action levels of what would be considered, I guess, relatively safe in food. And these values are subject to being lowered over time as we find out more and more about the toxicity of PFAS. And also, these are just regulated for PFOS, which again is one type of PFAS out of like the class of 12,000 of them. But these are Maine's action levels. So if you go over to the beef, we can compare that to what the EU's level is. The EU is at 0.3 parts per billion, and then at Maine, they're at 3.4 parts per billion. So they both do have standards, but they just vary a little bit based off of that toxicity level and that type of thing. And so this is a survey of food in the United States. The samples were collected in Philadelphia, but they collected a variety of samples from meat to poultry to catfish to eggs, and they tested them for 74 different PFAS compounds. And what they found here was that there weren't any PFAS detected in eggs, chicken, or pork from what they had sampled, and that PFOS was found in 25% of the beef samples, so 5 out of 20 at the levels of 0.05 7 to 0.145 parts per billion. So even though the PFAS was detected there, those levels are going to be lower than both the EU and the Maine action levels. So they were detected, but at relatively low concentrations. And then from the catfish, they had 12 different PFAS detections, totaling 1.8 parts per billion. And there was a quote in here that we wanted to highlight, but detection of PFAS precursors highlights the need to include these in PFAS in future monitoring efforts. So PFAS precursors are chemical compounds that can be transformed into more stable, persistent PFAS, like PFOA or PFOS, through degradation in the environment or the body. So these compounds can transform into toxic PFAS. So basically, it's just saying that it's really important that we have a wide scope of testing so that we know how many things or how many different compounds are in our food, because some of them, although we may not know a lot about them, are able to transform into more toxic PFAS that we do know are harmful for you at some level. So this figure does a really nice job of going through how PFAS are moving from industries where they're produced all the way into getting onto our farms and into our food and our drinking water. So starting on the left from industry, PFAS can be discharged into the air, or it can go directly to streams or into groundwater, or it can also go to wastewater treatment plants. Another entry point to a wastewater treatment plant is leachate from landfills, which can also be contaminated with PFAS, depending on what waste is going to the landfills. And at wastewater treatment plants, they separate the liquid waste and the solid waste, and the solid waste is referred to as sewage sludge. And then when the sewage sludge goes through like trash screening and pathogen reduction processes, that end product is called a biosolid. Unfortunately, those processes that they go through for pathogen reduction and stuff, that doesn't actually get rid of the PFAS in the biosolids. So depending on what's upstream of the wastewater treatment plant, the biosolid products can become contaminated with PFAS and then spread onto farmland. And so this is just an estimate, and depending on the source, this answer varies a little bit, but it's estimated that between 5 and 10% of cropland in the US has applied contaminated biosolids. So that is a major source of how farmland can become contaminated, but there are a couple of other sources like contamination from water supplies. For example, if you're pulling up contaminated groundwater for irrigation, or you're feeding your animals contaminated feeder water, and then their manure goes onto the land and that type of thing. That's how PFAS can cycle on a farm. And then more minor sources would be like rainwater, legacy pesticide applications, and contamination from packaging materials. The packaging materials are primarily concerned if they're going into like compost and they have a PFAS coating on them, then they can end up contaminating the compost. So what is being done about biosolids? We do not have any federal regulations for PFAS and biosolids. Some states are waiting for federal guidance about what to do with their biosolids. And some states have actually outright banned the land application of biosolids. So then their options would be landfill, incinerate, or send out of state. The complication with this is that landfills sometimes have a limited capacity for the amount of biosolids that they're able to receive. So if you ban this year after year after year, those can reach capacity with what they're able to take. Incineration is also complicated because it needs to be a very specialized facility to reach the temperature actually needed to destroy PFAS, which can be thousands of degrees Celsius. So that is a challenge as well. Otherwise, you just end up with PFAS in the ash product that then goes back to the landfill and can further contaminate the environment. Or sending out of state obviously would be a challenge as well, because then you can overflow the capacity that other states are able to have. And then several states have plans to phase out their biosolid usage. And then some states like Michigan, we actively regulate PFAS in our biosolids for land application. And a major goal of Michigan is to look upstream of the wastewater treatment plant and try to stop major dischargers of PFAS from polluting and ending up at the treatment plant. So this link here is a useful resource that kind of compares all of the state actions about PFAS governance across the United States. In one category in particular that I wanted to highlight was the biosolids, but these states in green are states with regulations or guidance about PFAS and biosolids. And then the stripes is that they're planning to implement PFAS regulations or guidance for biosolids. But it just goes to show that when we handle things on a state-by-state basis, some states will wait for that federal guidance and some states will take charge. But we really need like a united front to be able to manage this on a larger scale. So now just highlighting what I could pull together for information about how biosolids are regulated for Illinois and Iowa. In Iowa, there was a bill introduced in March of 2025 that would require the treatment plants to test their sewage sludge, which is the untreated biosolids, for PFAS. And then they would have to test this prior to land application and notify the farmers so that they could then deny the sludge if they didn't want to spread that on their land. And that link just goes to that bill if you wanted to read more about that. And then in Illinois, I reached out to their EPA and they had informed me that there are 61 National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits that have PFAS best management practice requirements and PFAS monitoring requirements. 48 of these are industrial, 13 are municipal. And by the end of 2026, they hope to have 350 of these permits. And that leads to how biosolids are regulated in the state of Michigan. So two main things here, one being the industrial pretreatment program, which launched in 2018. But the goal here was to identify sources of PFAS at wastewater treatment plants and control or eliminate them at the source and requiring source reduction prior to the discharge of PFAS. So those main industries that had been polluting and discharging would have to limit their discharge or the influent coming into the wastewater treatment plant to try to reduce the overall levels of PFAS getting into the solid waste or biosolids. And then how we manage the land application of biosolids. They're monitored for PFOA and PFOS, although they do testing for 28 compounds. They're regulated on these two specifically. But if they're less than 20 parts per billion, they can be applied on land. If they're between 20 and 100 parts per billion, that land application rate is just reduced. And then they will look more into the sources leading towards the contamination at the plant. And then if they're above 100 parts per billion, you cannot land apply, and they have to implement a source reduction plan to lower those levels.
So I'm going to take over now. This is Faith again, and go back to our Michigan farm. So in 2021, I believe it was, the regulators were looking at different wastewater treatment plants and found a particular wastewater treatment plant that the product coming out of it was testing over 2,000 parts per billion. So as you can see here, we're looking for less than 20, and this particular wastewater treatment plant was putting out over 2,000. So then they contacted the farm and started testing. And the soil there, the PFOS was up to about 100 parts per billion. There was no groundwater contamination. Thankfully, the PFAS stayed in the soil and ran off into surface water, unfortunately, up to 533 parts per trillion. They then tested the crops. He was growing corn silage, sorghum, and haylage, so a small number of crops, but all had detectable levels of PFAS that they were concerned about. And one thing that's really interesting in looking at these forage samples is the haylage was testing in the thousands, right? 2,000 to 3,000 parts per billion. And that was not grown on the most contaminated land. The most contaminated land was actually producing that corn silage. So that's a clue in the difference in uptake, how these plants are uptaking PFAS and distributing it differently. So the haylage was really taking up the PFAS and contaminating the crop. He was feeding these to his animals, and initially they took 6 samples from 3 different animals and had detectable levels of PFOS. Again, we do not have food safety standards in Michigan or federally to go by. So this left a pretty difficult job for regulators to determine, is this a food safety risk to the public? Recently, around the same time, USDA had sampled grocery stores. I don't have data on exactly where these samples came from, but it was about 2,500 beef samples, and they had non-detect in over 99% of the samples. So they only had 5 detects of P, PFOS in beef. So Michigan took that information and decided that this was not a normal situation of the beef produced in this farm. So MPART, our Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, had to conduct a risk assessment. And that's how we're doing it now is farm by farm without guidance. And so they had to look at, what do they think the uptake is from the soil to the crops to the beef? What do they think the exposure is to the consumers? So the daily consumption of the product. It's important to note this farm was doing a lot of direct sales. So when they look at what the exposure is, they're basing it off of, a family that buys a large amount of beef from one farm and consumes that maybe for a year. They had to consider what toxicity value they're going to use for PFOS. There's debate in that. And then consider variation and susceptibility among the population, the health status, body mass, age, what other exposures, if it's somebody that's already working in a PFAS factor or a factory where they're using PFAS, something like that. And then an uncertainty factor, because there's so much that we don't know about PFAS. And in the end, they determined the consumption of the beef from this farm was a public health hazard, and they issued a product recall. This is a huge emotional toll on the farm. The land had been in his family over 100 years. He loved being a beef farmer, planned for his kids to take over the farm, and they're no longer able to produce agricultural products intended for human consumption. So a really sad story on how the outcome of this farm that they did not know that they were walking into this risk in taking biosolids. So currently, MSU owns the animals and we lease the ground and we're using the farm for research. So some of the things that we're working on is developing a non-lethal diagnostic tool to link plasma concentration to muscle so we can help farmers determine how long it takes to get the PFAS out of the animals, because that is very possible. And it takes a couple months on clean feed, although we don't quite understand the link between plasma and muscle. So it'd be really nice if we're able to just take a blood sample and feel confident on how much PFAS is in the muscle. Determine the holding conditions that help accelerate depuration. So can they be on a dirt lot? Do they have to be on concrete? What to do with the manure when you have contaminated manure? What do we do with that? Is there a way to get the PFAS out of it? Transfer factors from soil to plants and a variety of crops to animals. I'm going to show you some data here in just a minute on crops. And then also we're doing a lot of researching methods to try to immobilize the PFAS in the soils. It's pretty complicated when we start talking about plants and soils. There's so much that we don't understand. So, looking at, does the PFAS bind in the soil? Does it move into the groundwater? Is it taken up into the plant? It's not very straightforward. So there's a lot of variability. Which PFAS chemical are we talking about? Is there more than one PFAS chemical? Because they work together. The soil carbon, the organic matter looks like it plays some kind of effect in what happens to the PFAS there. Growing medium, the mineral content, the plant itself, how much protein and lipid are in the plant, the pH, how often you're watering, the growing season, and then there's interaction with all these variables. And then we need to consider which portion of the plant is being consumed. I'll show you some data on corn here in a few minutes. That's really important. So we're starting to understand these things, but it's just not very simple. Here's a chart that I like to look at that does make it look pretty simple. And this study was out of China with a really contaminated ground just outside of a PFAS plant. And they looked at all kinds of different crops that they were growing here and different types of PFAS. And all the way from the left is low accumulation of PFAS, and to the right, it's higher accumulation of PFAS. And this isn't very straightforward because they looked at different chemicals and the chain length really mattered. But I think the general idea here is pretty easy to understand that the grains tend to have your lowest PFAS accumulation, and then the roots, and then as you go into the shoots, the leaves are accumulate a lot of PFAS. And so you can think about that with if you're having pasture or hay, the same thing happens here. You don't want to grow spinach and lettuce on PFAS contaminated soils, but producing corn grain might be a better option. So this is a really simplified diagram, but I think it's good to keep in mind. So some work from Maine that I wanted to highlight here is just this complexity on how PFAS move between media. And sometimes we think we have it figured out, and then something like this happens. So I'm going to draw your attention to the left, where we look from soil to hay to beef. And on the y-axis here is all these different PFAS chemicals. And let's take, for example, PFDA here in the middle. It's really high in soil. And then they measured it in hay, and it really barely showed up. So if we were only measuring hay, we would have no idea why there's so much PFDA showing up in our beef. And this gets to be pretty confusing that some tissues accumulate PFAS more than others. I think one thing here, PFOA, the second down, is one we've concentrated a lot on. And it's in the soil, it's in the hay, and then look, it barely shows up in beef. And so as we're understanding more how these PFAS move between different media, it gives us a lot of tools to be able to help farmers knowing which chemicals we have and how we're going to manage it. And then the three graphs on the right are soil to grass to milk. And you could see that the predominant PFAS in milk would be PFOS. So that's the one that we want to be checking for and monitoring the most in milk. This is more data out of Maine that gives us some clues on how PFAS are moving through our plants. And so this was data from 2024. This was actually a contaminated farm that decided to work with the university and with the Department of Ag and trying to help other farmers figure out how to manage their ground, their contaminated ground. So in this diagram here, it's a bunch of different perennials, the first cut and then the second or whatever after that. And they're looking at transfer factors. That's a ratio of how much is moving from the soil up into the plant. And what I'd like to point out here is first cut is always lower than your second cut for everything. We've got Timothy at different harvest times, fescue, orchard grass, and then alfalfa. And your first cut is almost always lower. Sometimes it's equal, like in the orchard grass late harvest, but second cutting is going to be higher. So that's something we can use in managing our animals and our pastures as well. The mechanism for this isn't exactly understood. It could be something to do with plant stress or the heat. There's a lot more leaves in your second cutting, so that it could be very simple like that. Then this is annuals, and note that the y-axis is different. It's much smaller here, so we've got winter triticale, oats in different stages, forage peas, and then some mixes. So huge variation in different plants, and these slides will be available later if you want to look at it in detail on how to manage your particular farm. And then this is really interesting. So the PFAS transfer factor in corn, if you remember a couple slides ago, that study in China, I said that the grains accumulate the least PFAS. And this is a great example of it. So we've got our silage and then our snaplage with all the tops. Those are the same. So A, the same letter. So, and then if you move down to grain, it's non-existent basically. They probably measured something. There's a little tiny bar there. But this is really important strategy if you have contaminated fields to prioritize producing grain on those fields where the PFAS is not moving all the way up into the grain. Silage would be a riskier crop to have in contaminated fields. And this is another study out of Maine looking at first cutting versus second cutting, and it shows the same pattern that I just showed you, where second cutting is always higher. But what I wanted to point out here is the difference between year two and year three cuttings, because just when we think we've really got it figured out, this is a plot, like for example, look at plot three here the y-axis is different, the scale is. So here we're looking, around zero point 0.3 transfer factor, and then we come back the same exact plot the next year, and we're up to the 0.5, zero point 0.6. So why is that? The variability is just huge, and there's so much that we don't understand about transfer factors and what is influencing the soils and the plants to uptake PFAS. So it gets pretty complicated, but we're learning more and more and more, and we're really appreciative of all the work that Maine is doing and hoping Michigan can start contributing to this data in a meaningful way soon. All these are management strategies to help farmers with contaminated fields. So now we're back to our beef farm case study in Maine, and I'm just going to take a minute to orient you to the layout of the land here. So all the way on the left would be the farm field use. So the yellow boxes they were using as hay, and the green was pasture. And they did not spread biosolids on their pasture. However, they did on their hay fields. And in the middle here, the soil PFOS ranges from, barely detectable all the way up to pretty hot in the soil. Not as hot as I've ever seen, but pretty hot. So this was causing contamination into the beef. And the farmer's typical production strategy is outlined here in the bottom. So calves would be born in the spring, graze on clean pasture, then come in the fall, and they were fed hay produced in the contaminated fields. So accumulating more PFAS in the body and the muscle, then in the spring, turned back out on pasture, and then again in the fall, brought in, fed contaminated hay, and then slaughtered in the spring, where the muscle PFOS level it showed contamination. And so they wanted to figure out how can this farmer continue farming and with some modifications. We don't have strategies yet to take PFOS out of the soil to deal with any of the PFAS on a practical scale. There are a lot of technologies that are showing some real promise, but right now they're too expensive to use on a basis like this. So they wanted to figure out what can they do. So they got together and they started working on some modeling. So instead of, feeding these animals clean hay for a long time and then measuring and then seeing did it work, did it not work, how can we start to accelerate this process? And this is a published study. I'd encourage you to go take a look at it if you're interested. I'm just going to give you the highlights here. So in these boxes, the blue or the orange would be what the model predicted. And so we've got this pattern of summer being out on the clean pasture, and you could see the PFOS level going down. They're brought in, put on contaminated hay. So this is a model for what that would look like. And then the red are actual samples. And you can see that they're pretty close. And so this is really promising that we can start to put in different scenarios and help farmers figure out, okay, well, what if you fed clean feed starting in January? Would that get our mussel levels down to a level that's safe to be put on the market? Or what if we do something else? We could start to put in these different scenarios. And what I'd like to point out here on the PFOS and the mussel, the dotted line would be 3.4, which is Maine's action level. So on these scenarios, they were able to get the farm beef down below those. And then the solid line would be the European standard of zero point 0.3. In this scenario, we weren't quite able to get those levels down. So if the action levels change, then this farmer is going to have to do something different to get her levels down. So, an update on the farm. They are still farming, and what they decided to do instead of in the fall, pull in the cattle and put them on the hay. All of her hay fields were contaminated. She's now selling them. They depurate on the clean pasture. The government is coming in and taking some samples and making sure that they're confident on how she's handling it. And then she sells the steers to be finished somewhere else. And I asked her, like, how do you feel about that? Are you sad? And she kind of laughed and said, no, it's kind of nice not to have to go out in the winter and deal with all these extra animals. So for this farm, it's a win. She's able to continue farming and make it work. So here in Michigan, we are really just beginning our work. We only have the one farm, and we need to continue working with farmers, and they're scared, rightfully so. Nobody wants to be put out of business, and there's a lot of really scary things when we don't know enough about PFAS. So we did some focus groups in the spring of this year, trying to understand the perception around PFAS. And what we found out was farmers told us that they have a trust for the university and for their commodity organizations, and they have a strong distrust for the government. They have a desire for more education in PFAS, both for the farms and for the consumers. They want to see more research. They have belief that the regulations should focus on the industrial users of PFAS, not the farmers. And they are interested in testing the soil, the water, the crops, and or their products. And they felt very strongly that it needed to be voluntary testing and it needed to be confidential. Back to the distrust for the government. And their concerns, they have concerns about backlash from testing. If people find out that they're contaminated and their neighbors haven't tested, how will they be treated? They're worried that they're going to be regulated too harshly without scientific basis. And this is where the work that Maine has done, I think, is really imperative, coming in, working with the farmer, bringing the farmer to the table. And their goal is to keep farmers in business. So that's really helped guide our work here in Michigan, that we've seen that they could do it successfully. That's what we want to do as well. Farmers are worried that they're going to find PFAS and there's nothing they could do about it. They're worried about the consumer's health. They don't want to be producing a contaminated product. They're worried about their own health. They're worried about their land values if their land is contaminated with PFAS. And they're worried about food production being outsourced to other countries if it's overregulated in the US. These headlines that I showed you earlier today demonstrated that farmers have good reason to be scared. And we have got to do better in supporting our agricultural communities. So just briefly, how else is PFAS getting into our food? Packaging. So there's a consumer push for reduced food packaging, and specifically in the In Europe, they're doing a lot of testing and regulation. In the US, we're doing it state by state. Last I looked, I think there was 12 states that have restrictions on intentional use of PFAS in packaging. And it's very specific to one or two chemicals. And like I think California is like in fiber-based food packaging. So again, that's another area where we could use federal guidance. I was recently at a conference and spoke to people that are doing the food packaging work, and they said it's very daunting to try to keep up with different states. I found this really interesting. So, this was a press release, sorry, it's kind of fuzzy, in February, where the FDA announced that they're ending the sales of PFAS used in food packaging. And I thought this was kind of misleading because it's two chemicals, PFOS and PFOA, that is being voluntarily phased out. And then a month later, here's this study, a summary of a study where they found 61 unexpected chemicals in food packaging. I think there's 157 that are PFAS that are approved to be used in food packaging, and there were 61 in this study that weren't approved at all. So we still have a lot of work to do in getting this out of our food packaging. And just briefly, as we come to a close, this was just released last week. I really encourage you to go look it up. This came out of the American Farmland Trust, working together with 16 other agricultural organizations to make federal policy recommendations. And I think these are really solid, provide relief and long-term support for impacted farmers. That's what's holding a lot of states back from helping their farmers. Protect farmers from unreasonable liability under CERCLA. Like Katie talked about earlier, our farmers should not be liable if PFAS are running off of the farm fields and into surface water. Farmers did not intentionally put PFAS there. They did not know that. Reduce additional PFAS contamination of agricultural land. We need to stop applying PFAS to our land. Coordinate and invest in PFAS research, and implement a coordinated education and risk communication strategy. So I put the link there. I think if you Google American Farmland Trust PFAS, you'll find this. And Katie also has it as resources at the end. So our main takeaways: forever chemicals are not forever in livestock. They can be depurated. They need to be on clean feed, clean water, and in a matter of months, we can get the muscle down to safe levels. Same thing in chicken eggs, it's even faster. Testing is imperative to stop exposure routes. You have to know what you have and test your water, test your water, test your water for yourself and for your animals. PFAS are not an acute toxin, so intervention is essential. We need to stop exposure. And the science is evolving and it's creating this really dynamic situation. So expect changes. I know it can be frustrating if you feel like the goalpost is constantly being moved. And that's kind of the world that we live in PFAS. We're learning more and more. And then I personally feel coordination on the national level is much needed. PFAS doesn't stop at state borders. So what our neighboring states do really makes an impact. And then here's some research or resources, the MSU Center for PFAS Research. Katie and I are planning some more upcoming webinars. This was kind of a general overview of agriculture, and we would like to get into crop specific and animal specific this winter. We have our own extension PFAS page. The Michigan PFAS Action Response Team is an interagency collaboration. So we've got a lot going on there. And then the link to that agricultural policy work group at the Farmland Trust. So I know that was a lot of information and we probably went over time, but thank you very much.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat now. We also have some publications that I'm posting in the chat. If anyone is interested in those related to how PFAS affects animals.
So Eric asked a question, is there a way to have your water or land, etc., tested for PFAS? Yes, there is. And Eric, depending on where you live, so many resources. So Katie, could you post a link there to the labs that you have, your Google Doc for the different labs?
Yeah, let me go grab that.
Katie has come up with this really great resources that shows what labs, and we work here in Michigan. We have a lot of labs, so whether they test water, are they testing soil? There is a test kit for water that's $79 that you could do in your own home. So most, like our official Eagle lab is like, I think it's like $350. It's a little bit different, and it's like a sponge that absorbs the PFAS and you mail it back in. So I've done it, and we also have a tip sheet on the best practices because PFAS are going to be in your bug sprays and lotions, and if you're using any of like the room air fresheners, they're probably going to have PFAS. So you really need to be careful about how you're taking the sample so that you're not accidentally contaminating it with air. So we've got some of those tip sheets on there. So in Iowa, the labs that'll work for soil, Katie, your labs there would they can mail them in, right?
Yeah, you can ship samples. You just need to make sure that you do it the way that is according to the laboratory. So I'd recommend reaching out to the lab ahead of time and communicating on what they want, but typically you have to ship it with like ice packs in a cooler and just make sure it stays cold.
And I don't know, like in Iowa, Alex, if you guys have dealt with any of this before, but the way that you're taking the sample, if you're looking at soil, is really important. And so we would be happy to do, a Zoom call with you or something and talk it over because samples are going to be $400, $500. So you really need to be strategic on how you're sampling. What information do you want to know? Do you have a map of where they spread biosolids, or is this just kind of a general survey? Take a bunch of samples, maybe mix them all together. So it's really important that you strategize how you're going to sample. So we would be happy to work with you and Alex, whoever. I don't know if you guys have people there that have worked on this sampling of PFAS before, but
Feel free to reach out to any of us and we'll work right together.
yeah, we can work together on it. Does Maine, Michigan have data for soil crops, livestock for farms that receive biosolids with lower levels of PFAS? That's really interesting. So, um, we do have, so in Michigan, we've done a survey of forested areas. So areas that have never received PFAS, never received biosolids, shouldn't have anything other than rain. And it went from like non-detect up to, was it Katie, 0.88? So just under 1 part per billion of
Yeah, I
PFOS.
believe it was P zero point 0.8 of PFOS.
PFOS. So that's what we're calling the background level. Every state's a little different. I know, like in Maine, they have a different number for rural versus urban. And actually, Katie and I just put in a grant proposal working with Washington, the state of Washington, to go out and look at farm soil levels that have been taking biosolids that were not industrially impacted. They've been doing that work there in Washington for like 20 years, putting biosolids on that have not been industrially impacted, and they're not seeing very high levels at all. And do you have anything else you would like to add to that, Katie?
Yeah, I'm looking for a link because I know Michigan did a study where they looked at some wastewater treatment plants that were producing biosolids that were non-industrially impacted, and they did a little bit of preliminary soil sampling. I don't believe they did any crop sampling from those, but I'll put the link in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? If there's anybody else from other states that have information about soils or biosolids that were non-industrially impacted to that were spread on farmland, I'd be very interested in the answers to that too.
We do have one more question. Would it be possible to repost the link to the Illinois water sample map?
Yes, let me pull that up right now. And then hopefully we can find a way to share the slides with everyone as well, because there were some useful links throughout there.
Definitely.
Yeah, and we have a bunch of handouts on our website as well. Before we sign off, I'll pull that up quick. So this is the website that Katie and I have. And then if you go under resources, so we have different educational help handouts here. So like we have this tips for collecting water samples. This is specifically like for homeowners, but same good practices. This is specifically Michigan, so about biosolids and PFAS and what we're doing about it. We've got one on septage. We've had some questions about septage. And then just PFAS in agriculture. So if those are helpful to you, feel free to use those and download those.
I will also repost our Facebook page link here. where we'll post where um, the recording of this session as well, and anything else we receive. That way, it can disseminate some of the knowledge.
Um, as Alex as Alex said, I am Faith Cullens Novus, joined by Katie King here from Michigan. So we are very happy to be with you.